local environmental conditions, but won't really experience changes in a major fundamental way. Now, in general, species one isn't evolving to look like species two while they're both coexisting in the same community. And this is a pretty fundamental pattern that spans both ecology and evolution. And so the stranding of species on these fitness peaks really underlies the observable structure of ecological communities in the wild. In other words, rugged adaptive landscapes, rugged representing this uneven distribution of fitness or survival across trait space, underlies much of the biodiversity that we see in nature. Ongoing evolution is this critical force in maintaining ecological communities. And so the existence of the adaptive landscape as a metaphor has really provided a fundamental way in which we think about life on Earth. A few years ago, I wrote a review that kind of broadly discussed some of these topics. But what stood out for me when I was searching for empirical evidence for some of the points I wanted to make, I realized that some kind of major questions around these topics still remained unclear. The reason that I've drawn a hypothetical fitness surface here is because fitness landscapes for multiple species, for entire communities, have never really been generated in the wild. And so despite adaptive landscapes representing this incredibly powerful kind of conceptual heuristic for the ecology and evolution of species diversity, the concept has largely remained metaphorical at the community level. And so this really represents the conceptual backbone of my research interests, taking a big scale, a macro scale pattern of biodiversity, like the structure of ecological communities, and using field studies to try and bridge our understanding of how ecological and evolutionary processes, really small local, spatial and temporal scales, may act to underlie that big pattern. So like how, if we measure the survival of lizards in Miami, what can that tell us about big patterns of lizards through space and time? But enough about birds. That's the last bird you're going to see in the whole talk. Today, we're going to be talking about lizards, organisms that I would argue are the best organisms in the world, but also perfect for the ecological and evolutionary topics that my lab studies, and also very, very cool. Given the general theme of my talk in this seminar, I wanted to devote an entire slide to the Southeast only native anole, this green anole. Beautiful and criminally underrated. They're fascinating for lots of different reasons. And so using lizards, this fascinating and very diverse group of organisms, I'll introduce you to my research questions that I'm going to talk about in this seminar today. So first, do these rugged fitness landscapes actually exist at the community level? Well, some studies have probed the adaptive landscape of single species. Despite being foundational, this hypothesis has very rarely been tested at the community level. And so I'll present to you some of my recent research on this topic. Second, how could an adaptive peak shift occur? In other words, how could a species jump from one of those survival peaks to another and change their morphology, when our understanding is that it should be incredibly difficult to do so? And so I'll discuss with you how interspecific interactions might result in this pattern through the process of character displacement. And lastly, we'll explore how at the very local scale, and the local scale being a place in Miami, which I'll talk about later, entire communities respond to environmental disturbances, and how these insights might scale up to explain global patterns of biodiversity. So before we get into the hard research, I'm going to introduce you to the lizards that I generally study for the majority of my research, not exclusively, but I've been focusing on them a lot for the last few years. And their distribution spans this entire region within these dashed lines, which of course includes the Southeast USA. But today we're really going to be focusing on the islands of the Greater Antilles in the Northern Caribbean, the islands of Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. And these are really a peculiar set of islands because on each of these islands, independent lineages of lizards in the genus Anolis, commonly called anoles, just like the green anole we have here, have independently adaptively radiated to produce communities of the same sets of habitat specialists, which we call ecomorphs. Each ecomorph is adapted to its unique ecological niche. And so this conceptual figure here, the tree with the lizards on, really nicely illustrates ecological community structure and niche partitioning in anole communities. And so a major niche tends to be the partitioning of vertical space, a degree of arboreality, and I'll talk about that more later on. So for example, there are terrestrial species in the group of trunk ground ecomorphs. These are some of my favorite lizards in the world. Each of these species are distantly related, yet strikingly convergent. They might vary a little in color and pattern, but they're almost identical in their body proportions. And also these radiantly green lizards, the arboreal canopy specialists. We could in fact find one of these wherever you are. I think I looked at the map of the group members on your website, and I'm pretty sure all of you are within the native distribution of green anoles. It's freezing today in Atlanta, so I'm not going to see any, but maybe you guys will have more success. Yeah, the interesting thing about anoles is all of these species here are more closely related to the brown trunk ground anoles from their respective islands than they are to each other. And this convergence extends to a handful of other ecomorph classes, with species after species and trait after trait showing these really spectacular similarities in form. And so these convergent communities have really provided an incredible opportunity to study the evolutionary replication of entire communities. And it's led anolis lizards, or anoles, to become a very powerful and historically very successful model system for understanding the ecology and evolution of species diversity. But I mean, like all study systems, there are gaps, like really major gaps in our knowledge. Despite being this great system for community ecology, for evolutionary community ecology, natural selection has never really been measured at the community level in anoles. And so while theory suggests that this multi-peaked fitness surface should drive this pattern of community structure, with the existence of fitness valleys really acting to maintain these ecomorphs on their respective peaks through time, this hypothesis has never really been empirically tested. But this isn't really just about anoles. Despite being foundational in ecology, in community ecology and evolution in general, it's incredibly rare that fitness landscapes have been measured in the wild on more than 2 species in any organisms. And so in both anoles and more generally, we know very little empirically about the role that contemporary ongoing natural selection may play in underlying the structure of ecological communities and in maintaining species as these distinct and divergent phenotypes. And so I really wanted to answer this question and using a community of 4 anolis species representing 4 different ecomorphs, so 4 niche specialists, I set out to quantify the phenotypes of all individuals in a community and measure fitness through patterns of survival. And so here I was really attempting to fill a key gap in our knowledge, bridging community ecology theory with empirical data. And first I want to show you a little bit of how we do this in the wild. These fancy surfaces might look complicated, but really it all starts at first with heading to the field and catching by hand all lizards in this community. So here on the left is the most common technique we use, which is a fishing pole with a little dental flossless so at the end. It might seem a little bit precarious. I'm sure some of you watching have done this before. If you haven't, you're more than welcome to come with me on fieldwork, and I can teach anyone to be good at it very, very quickly. And we also collect a suite of ecological and environmental data. And 2 advances have really facilitated our ability to conduct these types of studies at this scale. First, we can use these subcutaneous tags, which are only visible under a UV blacklight to secretly tag lizards, and it doesn't influence their survival. They also look really cool. It's a cool thing to use. And second is because we can now do most of our actual trait data collection back on campus outside of the field season. And that's where the hours can really stack up on field trips. So when we're in the field, we can collect images of lizards using equipment like portable X-ray machines or cell phones with macro lenses attached. And these are quick, easy, and reliable and highly detailed ways of capturing trait information in the wild. And then these images can be digitally measured back in the lab on campus, really providing plenty of work for the season, for the time when we're not in the field catching lizards. But one of the major reasons these types of studies are rarely attempted is because of the research effort that's needed. Measuring natural selection in the wild typically requires massive sample sizes, so the full extent of phenotypic variation can be accounted for, and this represents a tremendous amount of work. So for this project, we exhaustively sampled this community of 4 species, hand catching nearly 2,000 lizards to quantify all of the phenotypes that exist in this community. And so you won't believe how much blood, sweat, and tears went into this incredibly simple plot of just little grey dots, but you have to take my word for it that it did. Each dot here, each point represents the position of each individual lizard in this study in multivariate trait space. So we measure many features of these lizards and we combine them all into here just 2 multivariate axes, which really represent variation in morphological traits. And traits that we know are adaptively significant in anoles, things like leg length or the size of their toe pads. And so traits that we know are important for ecology, and so they might influence survival. Well, after catching all of these lizards and measuring them and marking them and then releasing them at exactly the same spot where we caught them, 12 months later, we returned to resample the community and establish which individuals had survived. And from those empirical survival data, we can then estimate how fitness is distributed at the community level across this entire trait space. But first, you might notice that there appears to be structure in the distribution of these points. And that's because these 4 species, as we'd expect in any ecological community, loosely form distinct clusters in trait space. And this is exactly what we'd expect. These species are phenotypically different, right? They each represent a separate niche specialist, a separate ecomorph class. And so traits in each of these species are adapted for the divergent niches that they occupy in this environment. And so I first wanted to know, given this interspecific structure in trait space, how likely is it that a fitness surface would estimate peaks in each of these species clusters through just a random survival of individuals? And so I developed a null model approach using permutation tests that randomly reshuffles the survival of individuals. And then we can estimate the shape of the fitness surface that each of these permutations produces. And it's possible to interpolate a continuous estimate of fitness or survival probability across this entire distribution of lizards by fitting a statistical approach known as a thin plate spline surface. It's a smoothing technique that can interpolate across irregularly spaced data. If any of you are familiar with general additive models, GAMs, similar to that, but think of that applying it across 2 dimensions. And so the density plot here shows the topographical complexity of the estimated fitness surfaces from these random simulations. The x-axis on this plot, the effective degrees of freedom, basically describes how rugged it is, right? How complex it is. If it's got a low value, it's really, really simple. If it's got a high value, it's very, very complicated. And so here, for example, over 90% of all of these simulations produce completely flat surfaces. There's no complexity at all. And this smaller peak to the right, which is a little bit more complex than flat surfaces, is still very, very basic. And so what we can see from those random simulations or random permutations of real survival data is that identifying a very, very complicated, a topographically complex, rugged, multi-peaked fitness surface in the wild, as theory has long suggested should exist and should underlie the structure of ecological communities, appears to be statistically a very, very unlikely scenario. And so now I'm going to show you the complexity of the fitness surface that we estimated from the empirical survival data, which were collected through this massive mark recapture research effort assessing the survival of all of these tagged individuals in the wild. And the complexity of the empirical surface, which is this dashed red line here, is incredibly unlikely to have arisen by chance survival. The curvature of the surface is more complex, more rugged than around 99% of all other configurations of individual survival. And so now we know that it's more complex than just a flat plane. I'm going to show you the fitness surface itself, and to remind you we're testing this foundational hypothesis that co-occurring species in an ecological community occupy independent fitness peaks on a complex, rugged, adaptive landscape. These null models suggesting that such a result would be incredibly unlikely. And so this is what we saw empirically from the empirical data. And so this, to me, when I crunched the numbers, was a thing of beauty. Like, after all of that hard work, making this figure was really unbelievable. But also, this is a thing of beauty biologically, right? This might represent the sort of pattern that underlies all of the biodiversity that we see around us, but which we can't visualize just by looking out in nature. For the most part, if we go out to the woods, to a forest or grassland or whatever, we don't know which individuals are more likely to succeed than others just by looking at them. And this is what this sort of figure can tell us. And so now comes the million-dollar question, our opportunity to test this long-standing hypothesis in ecology and evolution. There's 4 nice peaks there, but do they actually align with the distribution of each of the species in this community? Like, where are they positioned in this trait space? And the alignment isn't, a foregone conclusion. We might see that a species distribution overlaps with 2 separate fitness peaks, or perhaps a peak could be located where 2 species overlap, so in a zone of intermediate phenotypes. So now I was testing this kind of peak alignment hypothesis. And very much to my own excitement, each peak was occupied by a different species. These circle pins on in the main figure reflecting the location of each species' average mean phenotype on this fitness surface. And you can see here on the right the distribution of fitness relative to the boundaries of each species. And so each ecomorph really is sitting proud atop its own fitness peak in separate regions of the adaptive landscape. And so not only does each species occupy an independent fitness peak, but there exist these fitness valleys right between species. And so this provides really excellent evidence that natural selection is acting to maintain these species as different phenotypes, as divergent phenotypes through time. Any individual that's born with an intermediate phenotype, so a lizard that's halfway between a green knoll and a brown knoll, something that's intermediate like that, finds itself in this fitness valley. So it has a lower survival probability relative to one born at the same time that looks like a very average brown knoll. And so this really represents a very sophisticated insight into how natural selection actually operates in the wild at the community level, really pushing the boundaries, I think, of how evolutionary community ecology operates. And so this project for me revealed some incredibly exciting results. It revealed that it's possible to measure and identify these rugged community-wide fitness landscapes in the wild, and also provided really novel evidence to support classic theory that ecologically divergent species occupy independent fitness peaks on the adaptive landscape. And most importantly, that these peaks exist because of the presence of fitness valleys between species. And so really bridging the process pattern divide by showing how the survival of individuals at very small spatial and temporal scales may act to underlie this much bigger pattern of community structure. And so importantly for this group here, one quirk of this study needs to be addressed head on, right? And that's 3 of the 4 of these species are not native to Florida. And this study, I'm not sure if I said this study took place in Miami, in Florida. 2 are from Cuba. In fact, even the American green knoll arrived from Cuba approximately 5 to 7 million years ago. So it's really a member of the community, the Cuban community ancestrally. And 1 species was from Hispaniola, the Dominican Republic. And so the fact that we saw these strong patterns of selection that produces the rugged fitness landscape for this community suggests either that when they invaded, whatever co-evolutionary adjustments that may have been required for them to coexist and for the whole community to assemble must have occurred, very, very rapidly after they were first introduced, or that the niches of these ecomorph groups are so convergent across islands that independently evolved members of the same ecomorph class on different islands sit on nearly identical adaptive peaks, such that a Dominican trunk knoll here can just seamlessly enter a community of Cuban-derived species. The Cuban species just evolutionarily acting like it's a trunk knoll that they existed with in Cuba. So invasive species here being used to conduct an experiment that would almost definitely be ethically impossible for an evolutionary biologist to conduct, should they wish. And so with my previous research providing evidence for this lovely multi-peaked and apparently stable pattern at the community scale, I next wanted to ask, well, how can a species cross an apparent valley? How can it switch from one peak to another? In other words, how can a species transition from one distinct phenotype or ecological niche to another? And so this question has really been a classic puzzle in both ecology and evolution. Well, in community ecology and evolution, a major assumption in community assembly has traditionally been that once a niche is filled, it's unavailable to a very similar competitor. And this assumption is reinforced as many classic and current approaches in community ecology often assume that species traits remain fixed through time. For example, most community assembly null models just randomly reshuffle species and then infer coexistence patterns based on trait overlaps where two very similar species can't exist. So those models don't include evolution. But of course, as contemporary evolutionary ecologists, we know that natural selection is always operating. And with invasive species, we think about this a lot. Are they evolving? Is that what's facilitating their invasion in these new environments? Species in general are not fixed entities. They are evolutionarily labile, and they might in fact change very quickly if natural selection is strong. And so here, in my opinion, ecological and evolutionary theory is conflicted. On one hand, two species that occupy the same adaptive peak, the same niche, can't coexist ecologically. But on the other hand, the theory of ecological character displacement describes a process whereby very similar species can coexist through rapid niche divergence and subsequent evolutionary change. And so the theory of character displacement suggests that when in symmetry, in other words, when two species are co-occurring in the same place, ecologically similar species diverge in resource use and associated traits relative to those allopatric populations where only one species occurs. And the point of this divergence is to minimize niche overlap, resource overlap, and facilitate their coexistence. Otherwise, one will just extirpate the other. But very little is known about how character displacement actually plays out in the wild, despite this being a very powerful hypothesis in ecology and evolution. And traditionally, evidence has really been taken from geographic patterns of trait distributions. So we look across space, measure different populations, and see communities where both species co-occurring together and maybe diverge in different traits, taken as evidence to infer that the process had happened in the past. And that's because actually studying character displacement as a process in nature is really difficult, right? It's very rarely is it possible to identify novel contact zones between ecologically similar species in the wild, those assumed to occupy the same ecological niche and so the same adaptive peak. These convergent trunk ground anoles, for example, that we assume occupy the same adaptive peak, the same niche, have all evolved independently on different Caribbean islands. Well, an ideal experimental approach to test the hypothesis of character displacement would involve relocating populations of these species to create novel sympatric communities, and then we could observe any resultant shifts in resource use and phenotype relative to the allopatric source populations. But especially for terrestrial vertebrates, this approach is typically unfeasible and also unethical at large spatial and temporal scales. But the Anthropocene, Florida especially, has provided a unique opportunity to observe these types of scenarios unfolding in front of us. Two of these species have been introduced to South Florida, creating this evolutionarily novel situation and providing an incredible natural experiment in which to test the ecological character displacement hypothesis. My colleagues and I had previously published a paper that documents the detailed introduction history and subsequent dispersal dynamics of these species in Florida, meaning it's possible to identify novel zones of contact, as well as established sympatric communities. And so if it exists, study character displacement as a process unfolding in the wild, right at the range expansion, at the expanding range boundaries of invasive species. Using that as a tool, using that as a natural experiment, because those situations have historically been an exceptionally difficult and elusive scenario to identify in nature. And so what I'm going to show you here are 2 points that represent mean perch heights for each species in their allopatric populations in Florida, so populations where they do not co-occur. Perch height here on the y-axis, is a classic measure of habitat use that reflects more or less ecological niches in a knolls. So it's the distance that they perch from the ground, and would expect these convergent species to be highly ecologically similar. And we observe that they are. Right? They look the same and they behave the same, and they're actually extremely similar in many other aspects of ecological resource use. And so what happens when they come into contact? Well, they immediately diverge in perch height, spatially partitioning the environment to minimize ecological overlap. Crested anoles, Anolis cristatellus, the yellow species here on the right, perch higher, while brown anoles perch lower. Brown anoles being Anolis segrii, one of the most successful invasive reptiles in Southeast USA. But this lower perch height by brown anoles is really driven by increased terrestriality, right? The proportion of lizards that I observed on the ground jumps from around 2% when crested anoles are not present to 36% when they are present, a nearly 20-fold increase. So it's not just that they're sitting a little bit lower on the tree trunk, but they're on the ground a lot more. In fact, not only do we observe more brown anoles on the ground individually when we just walk around and look at them, but when we sat down and we watched nearly 200 individual lizards for nearly 50 hours in the wild, we observed that these more terrestrial brown anole populations ran between plants across the ground nearly 5 times more frequently. And so because of decades of research of anoles as a model system, particularly how morphology relates to performance in different types of structural habitats, it allows us to make predictions for how changes in habitat use may lead to adaptive shifts in morphology. What might happen evolutionarily? Are they going to evolve? And if so, is it predictable? And so brown anoles running across the ground look something like this. I hope it's work. I've only been in Georgia Tech a few months. I hope the internet's powerful enough to show you this video because it's really cool. It's one of my favorite videos ever. This is an actual brown anole from one of my study sites in this research project. And what might be apparent is the biomechanics that's at play, right? These nice, long, powerful limbs help generate the power to run fast on the ground, these hind limbs. And so for lizards living on the ground, sprint speed can be a critically important trait for survival, and so potentially a massive axis of selection. And so for sympatric populations that are forced to become more terrestrial, and that we saw running across the ground between trees at a much higher rate, we might expect those lizards' natural selection to have favored the lizards with longer limbs that can run faster. And so I set out to collect the data to test this comparative hypothesis. What I'm going to show you here is relative limb length on the y-axis, so limb length corrected for body size, and compare between brown anole allopatric populations where they're on their own and sympatric populations where they live with crested anoles. And what I discovered was a very clear pattern, but it really provided some very exciting evidence suggesting an adaptive response to increased terrestriality. Right? These sympatric populations had much longer limbs. And so these comparative data are compelling. But the biggest outstanding question in this theory really remains, and what's the actual underlying mechanism that can drive this pattern, that can lead to these trait differences? Evolutionary biologists have long contended that natural selection is responsible. But there's really little to no evidence for that from field studies of character displacement in the wild. And there's many other possible explanations for these types of patterns like plasticity or ecological sorting or things like that. And so I was desperate to answer this question, which has really long eluded these studies of character displacement. And so I identified a population of brown anoles right on the expanding edge of the crested anole invasion. And over 6 years, I caught thousands of lizards in the wild and measured their limb lengths, and tagged them and released them, and repeated this every 6 months to see which individuals survived and which died. and specifically testing the hypothesis that if natural selection is responsible for these trait differences, then following the invasion of crested anoles and in concert with increased terrestriality, individual lizards with relatively longer limbs should have a higher survival probability after crested anoles invade. And so here on the left, this is a selection surface showing how survival probability on the y-axis relates to relative hind limb length among individuals in this population. So as expected, prior to the arrival of crested anoles, there was really no effect of hind limb length on survival probability. It was flat. It didn't matter if you had long legs or short legs. There was no real, it wasn't a good predictor of whether you survived or not. Presumably at this time, other traits were much more integral to survival in the population at this time, head size or something else, for example. And so after 3 long years of monitoring this population, suddenly crested anoles invaded. And so now I had my chance to test this character displacement natural selection hypothesis. Does selection favor these long-legged lizards that can run faster for their body size across the flat ground? And this result here, transition quick, this result was amazing, right? It genuinely surprised me and shocked me. We had a prediction, we had a hypothesis. I didn't know if it was actually going to work or not. And so the presence of this relationship, but also the strength of it, was incredible. The longest legged lizards now have a 3 to 4 times greater chance of survival relative to those with shorter legs. So it appears a massive major shift in the selection regime underlies the character displacement that I observed. And so I was able to document that strong natural selection can drive these rapid trait shifts in the wild, really on observable ecological timescales. And these results really bridge the process pattern divides in our understanding of the theory of ecological character displacement. Invasive lizards being critical to expanding our knowledge on this very important eco-evolutionary hypothesis. Ecological divergence being the trigger for trait, ecological divergence when they come into contact being the trigger, and then directional selection, the subsequent process that shapes patterns of morphological change. Well, of course, I'd use these invasive species. I use these invasive species as unique natural experiments in evolutionary ecology. I said this at the start, but I want to reinforce this to make sure everyone knows where I'm coming from. They can be massively ecologically harmful. That isn't lost on me at all. And I'm not trying to apologize for that. It's very important to say that from the start. But unfortunately, this is the reality of the Anthropocene, as I'm sure all of you know. Species and entire ecological communities are experiencing huge levels of disturbances from many different environmental stresses, not just the arrival of invasive species. And so, in my mind, a clear question in biology as a whole is how stable are ecological communities to these different types of environmental disturbances. And so, although it was first noted over a decade ago, I can say over a decade ago now because it's 2024, there are still many environmental phenomena whose effects we don't fully understand at the community level. And this is true for both contemporary global change science as well as classic community level evolutionary ecology. As the world is changing, it will be crucial, be critically important to better understand how these disturbances affect entire ecological communities, not just single species. And so I think that integrating evolution to these patterns of ecological change is a major next step in bridging ecology and evolution to understand the future of biodiversity in a very different world. And so one type of environmental disturbance that poses huge risks to ecological communities are extreme climate events. Phenomena like unusual cold snaps. Atlanta, over the past week, we had, I think, 4 nights in a row in the low teens. No one told me that when they offered me a job and I moved here. It was freezing. I'm led to believe that's abnormal. There's hurricanes and droughts and exceptional rainfall. These are all extreme climate events that stand out as being unusual to typical weather patterns. And so while I appreciate that these events can cause huge devastation to human societies, particularly to many disadvantaged and marginalized communities, these types of extreme events also have the potential for natural selection to occur very, very quickly, changing the phenotypic distribution of a population almost overnight. And these topics are especially important right now because these types of extreme climate events are expected to continue to increase in both frequency and magnitude under contemporary climate change scenarios. And so it's important, I think, to rapidly understand the ecological and evolutionary consequences. And so one way that lizards can be massively impacted by extreme and unexpected climate events is by the way that they sleep, although I think that's been completely overlooked so far. And so there's lizards in this picture, and I'll give you a few seconds while I take a sip of water to see how many you can find. This is a scene that some of you in Florida can see any night of the year. And so if you counted 5 sleeping lizards, I hope the herpos in the audience found all of them. If you found 5, then you've passed the test and you can absolutely come and join us on fieldwork if you'd like to. If you found 6, then you can just come and take over my job. But the sleeping behavior is interesting because it's adaptive, right? All across the world, all diurnal arboreal lizards sleep at the very tips of vegetation during the night as an anti-predator behavior. As a nocturnal predator makes its way down a branch, lizards can detect the vibrations and instinctively drop to the ground and run off across the ground to seek refuge in nearby vegetation. And all of you in the Southeast can do this experiment. All right, find sleeping anoles, tap the branch a little bit towards the base of the trunk, watch them wake up, drop and run. It's a really neat show of behavioral ecology in the wild. However, this sleeping ecology has always been a bit of a puzzle to me as an evolutionary ecologist. Whereas during the day, these lizards can experience or do experience an incredibly thermally complex environment. Through thermoregulation, lizards can behaviorally manage their internal body temperature, right? If they're cold, they can bask in the sun. And if they're too hot, they can cool down in the shade. They can manage how hot or how cold they want to be. At night, however, that option doesn't exist. The thermal environment is homogeneous, right? You can barely see the lizard that's fast asleep on this leaf. I help you out, it's right here. It wasn't too difficult to find, but here's the head and the tail, and the lizard's just lying flat on the leaf, which is a very typical sleeping position. And it's difficult to identify in these thermal images because at night, this lizard's body temperature corresponds, or all lizards' body temperature corresponds to local air and substrate temperatures. Unlike their terrestrial counterparts, who can take advantage of thermal refuges at night like burrows, this ecology of arboreal lizard sleeping behavior suggests that they might be extremely vulnerable to cold temperatures. What's curious is this sleeping behavior evolves in these lizards because they're from the tropics, and that's considered to be a very thermally stable environment that doesn't generally experience much temperature variability. And because of this macroevolutionary thermal stability, tropical species are considered to be intolerant of major climatic variation. And so we think they'll be highly vulnerable to extreme heat or extreme cold. The red line here in this figure shows species vulnerability to climatic variations as it relates to latitude. The highest vulnerability occurs in tropical species, what we call thermal specialists. But whether there actually are or not is a really difficult hypothesis to test in the wild. It's difficult because most of the tropics is stable. And so taking a tropical species and putting it in an unstable environment would be hard to do. Florida, this new environment that these tropical species have invaded, isn't tropical. And does it occasionally experience cold temperatures? And so the presence of many invasive tropical lizard species represents this other unique natural experiment in evolutionary ecology, but more importantly, a unique natural experiment in climate change biology. And so I set about sowing the seeds for this type of evolutionary field study in the wild. In 2017, I measured the coldest tolerable temperature limits for 6 species of arboreal lizards co-occurring in the same community in Miami, Florida. 1 native, the green knoll, and the rest from many different places. On the y-axis here is CT-min, which is the cold temperature physiological tolerance limits. So basically, when we measure these lizards and cool them down in the lab, At what temperature do they cease being able to move? When can they no longer physiologically function? And so this graph here shows the high interspecific variation in CT min that existed in this community. And it suggested that if Florida got cold, if it experienced cold temperatures somewhere in this range, some species might be more vulnerable to cold temperatures than others. So I collected this with the, I moved to Florida in 2012 and was hearing stories of the 2010 cold snap and how rough it was, which led me to wanting to set up this project. But typical Miami temperatures don't, in general, get colder than these limits. And so I had to sit back and wait for an unprecedented cold front to come through. Winters came and went with typical temperatures, but almost 4 years ago, I think, 4 years ago this week, a freak 24-hour cold front swept through South Florida and brought cold nighttime temperatures that hadn't been experienced for many, many years. In fact, the temperatures that night fell below the cold tolerance limits of all species in this community. Now, I was in St. Louis at the time doing a postdoc, and so I quickly jumped on a plane and headed to Miami to try and see what had happened. Had any lizards survived at all? I had no idea. Well, I arrived into Miami to find some very cold and very grumpy lizards. Mortality clearly occurred at some scale, but I was able to find individuals of all species. And so I set about resampling their cold tolerance limits to try and discover what had happened. And I observed that every single species was showing a new, significantly lower CT min value. In other words, all species in this community could now, on average, tolerate colder temperatures. Now, it's not clear if this is evidence of a selection event or a plastic response, or possibly both, perhaps the response varying among species. I returned 10 weeks later and saw that these new thermal limits have been maintained, at least in the short term. But the weirdest result was that following this event, all species appeared to have converged on the same new thermal limit, around 7 degrees C. And this was weird because before the event, we'd seen that there was really high variation in cold tolerance limits. Now, of course, this could purely be because they just all experienced the same climatic event, the same environmental conditions. But perhaps this convergence might also suggest that 7 degrees C could represent some kind of physiological threshold of temperature tolerance that may exist in many lizards given the diversity of this community. Well, as I've explained, a central goal of my research program is always to try to bridge this kind of process pattern divide. And so here I wanted to understand how physiological limits that I observed and measured in the wild might underlie broader patterns of diversity across space and time. And so I took a look at how cold tolerance limits varied across all lizards, together here with one of my colleagues, Jan Salazar. He's actually measuring cold tolerance limits of lizards in one of the labs in Florida, in Miami. Together, we combed the literature and we extracted around 400 published cold tolerance limit values for over 200 species, practically all of the data that exists on this topic. The colors here represent the number of species in each bar, in each histogram bin. And on just looking at the data, something was clear. There seems to be a very high number of species who reach a cold tolerance limit somewhere around this high bar. In fact, it almost perfectly mapped onto what I'd seen in Miami. It was weird, right? Most species, here nearly 80% of all lizard species in our data set could not tolerate temperatures below 7 degrees. And so as an organismal biologist, I started asking myself, could the ecology of arboreal lizards, comprising this incredibly diverse group of organisms, could their ecology of sleeping exposed and therefore being vulnerable to cold temperatures, paired with this apparent physiological threshold of cold tolerance, underlie the entire global distribution of arboreal species? And so I accumulated a global lizard trait database and I classified the ecological habitat use of over 5,000 of the 6,500 species of lizards. And first, with graduate student Ari Miller, we asked a very simple yet unanswered question. If arboreality is so common in lizards, how many times has it actually evolved, right? If it's only evolved a few times, then perhaps thermal traits are just highly conserved in those lineages, explaining some of these patterns. Again, this question really being inspired by my interactions and my observations of invasive tropical lizards in Florida. They were the trigger that led me to asking these science questions. Well, it turns out that arboreality has evolved a lot, like way over 100 times independently in lizards. On this lizard phylogeny here, the grey tip points represent arboreal species, and the dark blue lines represent on the phylogeny represent an ancestral reconstruction that shows the repeated evolution of arboreality across the entire lizard clade. And so now it's clear that there's many independent origins of arboreality. I next wanted to know about its relationship with space. Like, what's the global biogeography of these species? And are there major environmental predictors of these macro scale patterns? Alongside one of my colleagues, Sarah Swiston, this is what we saw. At the top is the global distribution of all lizard species in the world. At the bottom is the distribution of arboreal ecologies in these lizards. And so grey regions in the lower map represents parts of the global lizard distribution that contain no arboreal species. And just by looking at the map, like, we can see that arboreal species are mainly distributed throughout tropical regions. But we can make clear hypotheses about what might influence the distribution of arboreal lizards in terms of habitat availability. For example, these arboreal lizards by nature live in trees, but on the global scale, like, neither forest cover nor tree canopy height or any of those variables were major predictors of either the presence, the diversity, or the proportion of arboreal specialists in local lizard communities. Temperate and boreal forests, for example, have apparently excellent habitat, but practically no arboreal lizards. Instead, the most robust environmental predictor was the coldest temperature that a region experiences. And so what I'm going to show you here, I promise I've only got 5 minutes left. What I'm going to show you here is a global diversity gradient of the relationship between arboreal lizards and the coldest temperature that an area experiences. And for this analysis, I employed a breakpoint regression model, which searches along a single linear regression and identifies a breakpoint at which the regression trend shifts in form. And so here, the breakpoint analysis will search for a temperature at which the diversity gradient of arboreal lizards, the global diversity gradient of arboreal lizards, significantly shifts in pattern. And specifically, we're testing this global scale hypothesis that somewhere in this temperature region, 7 to 8 degrees C, as informed by my empirical studies and my literature review and inspired by my observations of these tropical lizards in Miami, we might expect to see some kind of shift in diversity gradient. And yeah, this is really taking a punt, right? This weird observation from just 6 species in this tiny forest patch in Miami, and trying to extrapolate out to explain the entire global distribution of lizards. But really, amazingly, this is what I discovered, and I was genuinely astounded by this. Admittedly, I didn't think it would be this clean, but sometimes our discoveries in science are great. They're like, this is why we do it. They really amaze us, and it's why we love biology. And so this solid green line here is the diversity gradient of arboreal lizards, all lizards across the world. And this dotted green line is the estimated breakpoint at which globally arboreal lizards start increasing in diversity, right where we predicted that it might occur. And so not only do arboreal lizards not live in cold areas, there's practically none in areas that experience cold temperatures below 7 degrees, but diversity only really starts to increase from that point onwards too. And this is one of my favorite ever research results because it's very biologically interpretable. Right? If you're a lizard and you're ectothermic and arboreal and sleep outside, then it makes sense that it appears improbable to exist in any region that experiences temperatures colder than lizards can physiologically tolerate. And so this one observation of a group of invasive lizards in South Florida really might have led me to understanding what factors determine the entire global distribution of lizards. Invasive lizards here, or invasive species more generally, can be such a very powerful tool in biology when used as natural experiments. And this area of my research program attracted some very funny media attention, like capturing the public's interest with stories of raining iguanas. And of course, we know that this is a physiological response to these arboreal lizards reaching their CT min and losing all function and falling from the trees at night. But investigating this phenomenon could really provide a fascinating insight to evolution. And one of the underappreciated features of global climate change isn't just that the Earth is getting gradually warmer, but these extreme events, cold snaps and hurricanes and heat events, are expected to become increasingly unpredictable, right? So far, it seems as though they're becoming more frequent, more extreme. So they represent a very pressing situation that we need to understand the physiological consequences of, especially for ectotherms who are so very vulnerable to environmental conditions. And so I hope that my research here will really provide some novel insights into how species in general respond to bizarre extreme conditions during contemporary climate change, being able to use invasive species, as I said, as this natural experiment. But importantly, the outcome of this research kind of allows us to get ahead of the game. It will allow us to predict how native species might respond to increased climate variability, while also providing some applied knowledge as to how non-native species can successfully invade a new region and provide maybe some insights into their ability to either acclimate or adapt to new environments. Major features that can facilitate in the invasion success, but something that's not very well understood in vertebrates. And so with that, sorry, I chatted too much about lizards. I'll say thank you very much for your time, and ask you what questions you have. And most importantly, come and visit us. I'm brand new here at Georgia Tech. This is the start of my second semester. Please don't be a stranger. Come across, give a seminar, or ask me if there's any seminar slots. Or if you're passing through Atlanta, please drop in and say hello. And that's how you can contact me if we don't have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stroud. We actually do have time for questions if you'd like to stay on for a little longer, and if anyone has any questions. So yeah, feel free for anyone. You can drop them in the chat, or you can unmute your mic and feel free to ask away.
I have a question. Thanks, James, for a great talk. This is Brett Sheffers out of University of Florida. I'm trying to connect your first part of your talk with the second, because I noticed in the first part, the trunk and the trunk ground, it seemed like you had deep valleys for the subcanopy canopy species, but the trunk ground had a shallower valley. And I was just curious if maybe you observed, linking to the second part of your talk there, maybe you observed character displacement or maybe a change in the valley over time or something like that.
I haven't. It could also be just because I haven't really looked at it. Yeah, well, I mean, this is a fairly by natural selection field studies, it's a fairly long-term data set now. Most natural selection studies operate on very short timescales, often for just single species too. It's ongoing. I'm going back down this summer to continue it. And so we'll start piecing apart some of those like longer term trends. I haven't looked at the truncanole, Anolis disticus, the barcanole versus the brownanole. One thing I didn't say, or I didn't say explicitly, is the second part of the talk is based on the study site in the first part of the talk. So that invasive crested anole joined that community. And so I presented just the interaction between crested anoles and brown anoles, but really it gives us an understanding of how a single species might lead to evolutionary waves across an entire community. We can see it interacts very strongly with one species in particular. What's the broader community consequences? And so that's the next step of the research program. I'm trying to figure that out.
Thanks.
I will say as well, this is my first seminar as a faculty member, so a momentous occasion for me. Thanks everyone for watching.
Yes, thank you so much for coming out today and being willing to give this talk to us. This was definitely a very interesting talk. I'm also from Florida, so I'm used to the green anoles, the Cuban anoles, the crested. I've seen so many of them throughout like my time in Florida, and it's always a good sight to whenever I get to see a green anole.
I agree. Like I said at the start, I think they're criminally underrated. They're fascinating. They're beautiful for a start, but they're fascinating because They're fascinating for lots of reasons evolutionarily. Look at the latitudinal diversity gradient, the latitudinal gradient that they exist on. They experience very, very different environmental conditions. And so, it's interesting to understand how they've done it. They're one of the few arboreal specialist species that can exist above this apparent temperature constraint.
Could you see this kind of trend of different invaders and native species with their different abilities to adapt to their environment? Do you think that could exist outside of the reptile realm, especially the lizards?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the point of doing it with lizards isn't really to learn anything about lizards specifically. It's to learn about the mechanisms and the processes that these scenarios present to us, right? And so the whole idea about doing this sort of thing is trying to find rules that might be general across taxa or across space. We see it in Florida. If it was the same species in another part of the world, would the same thing happens? In other taxonomic groups, in birds or plants or anything, are we going to see the same thing? That's always the goal of this sort of research. And so I think the same patterns would exist.
Interesting. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Okay, if there are, feel free to send me an email. I'm more than happy. Oh, there is one.
Sorry, I almost lost the entire webinar for a second, which would not be good because it would have closed. Paul Evans with the University of Florida, another fellow herper, or herpo. I did have one question, as obviously in Florida, we're starting to get a lot more larger lizards that would follow into maybe not exactly similar ecomorphs, but similar in terms of various types of basilisks, amoebas, various lizards that starting to come in. How would some of this, since obviously these are more arboreal, translate into animals that aren't and moving through and impacting? So ones that's maybe just a ground animal, ground lizard. What are some changes there that maybe we could potentially see too, or?
Yeah, good question. You're right. So the basilisks are staying. They're not dispersing too quick. The big ones to watch out for are agamas, red-headed agamas, Agama picticorda. They're flying. When I first moved to Miami in 2012, they were still incredibly local. Now they're going to be everywhere soon.
I think it's 2/3 of the state now. We have them about as north as Orlando, almost through the entire turnpike system. I'm up in Gainesville, so they're not quite here yet, but it's always one of those things of has the right person just not seen them yet?
Absolutely. And there's a couple of life history features or ecological and life history features that make them amazing successful invaders. One is that they're rubble specialists, and so they lay their eggs in those massive gravel bags which get moved around. That helps being an invasive species. The second is because they're so terrestrial, they sleep for the most part underground in burrows, and I'm pretty sure that's what's facilitating their northward expansion in Florida. They're being shielded from cold weather. In terms of how might we see them evolving in response? I don't know. What we need to do is set up field studies to measure it, to understand what's happening. I mean, with a lot of these larger lizard species, we don't even have good collections data necessarily to measure morphology through time. And so I think the big thing is data deficient so far.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk.
No, thank you. It was a great question. I love talking about other types of lizards too.
All right. If there's no other questions, thank you everyone for coming out today. And thank you, Dr. Stroud, for presenting today.
Great. My pleasure.
I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Bye-bye.